The tires of my black Silverado crunched over gravel as I pulled up the long-forgotten drive that led to my family's ranch Oakridge. Dust curled behind me like smoke from a long-dead fire. This wasn't just land, this was legacy passed down, from my grandfather to me, spanning 3 generations and nearly 1,200 acres of unbothered freedom. I hadn't laid eyes on it in over a decade, not since I left for law school, but now, I was back. The wrought iron gate squealed as I pushed it open. The paint had chipped away, but the family crest was still etched into the center, a rearing horse beneath an oak tree, a symbol of strength, of stubbornness, traits that ran thick in our bloodline. I parked near the barn, which leaned slightly, as though exhausted from holding history on its back. The main cabin stood beyond it, weathered, but intact. I took in the familiar scent of dry earth and cedar, letting nostalgia wrap itself around me. This was home, and yet, something felt off. A pristine wooden sign stood at the property line, drilled into the post I distinctly remembered painting with my grandfather. Oakridge Estates HOA jurisdiction begins here. Below it, in smaller print, no trespassing, without HOA approval. All structures subject to community regulation. I blinked. HOA, on my grandfather's land. Before the shock could settle, a voice pierced the silence. "Excuse me, you can't be here." I turned toward the shrill call and spotted her, short, tightly wound, dressed in an expensive tracksuit and armed with a clipboard like it was a badge of authority. She marched toward me like a prosecutor heading for the bench. "I'm Karen Monroe, president of the Oakridge Estates Homeowners Association. You're trespassing on private property." I raised an eyebrow. "This is my ranch," she scoffed, highly doubtful. "This land has been absorbed into the HOA. All owners were notified." "No one notified me," I said calmly, though heat rose in my chest. "Well, then maybe you're confused," she snapped. "This area is for residents who follow our regulations. We don't tolerate squatters or unauthorized activity." "Squatters," I nearly laughed, but I kept my voice steady. "I have the deed in my truck." She crossed her arms. "You have 5 minutes to leave, or I'm calling the sheriff." I looked her dead in the eye. "Call them." She did. 15 minutes later, 2 sheriff's deputies rolled up in a dusty cruiser. One of them, Deputy Holt, stepped out cautiously, hand resting near his holster. The other hung back, eyes scanning the scene. "Sir," Holt began, "we received a report that you're trespassing on HOA property." I nodded slowly, then reached into my briefcase on the tailgate and retrieved a manila envelope. "Here's the deed, filed with the county. The land's been in my family since 1938. I'm the sole legal owner." Holt scanned the documents. Frowning, he called something into his radio, then walked over to Karen. "Ma'am, do you have documentation showing this property belongs to the HOA?" Karen faltered. "The board voted to expand the jurisdiction line. It was a unanimous vote." "That doesn't transfer ownership," Holt said, his voice firmer now. "Unless the owner agrees in writing and records it with the county. The vote doesn't mean anything." "But he doesn't belong here," she insisted. "I belong more than anyone," I said. "This isn't a cul-de-sac with flower pots and bake sales. This is a working ranch. Or it was, before it got hijacked by power-hungry busybodies with too much time and too little land." Karen's face twisted with fury. The deputies left, having no grounds to act, but I could feel her eyes drilling into me like she thought she could burn my name off the deed with her glare alone. She leaned in close before storming off. "You may have won this round, but I run this neighborhood. Enjoy your little rebellion, while it lasts." I watched her leave, already knowing how this would go. She'd come back with papers, rules, threats. But what she didn't know was that I wasn't just a rancher, I was a ruthless attorney, and she'd just declared war on the wrong man. By the time the weekend sun set over the hills, Karen Monroe had escalated from clipboard-wielding nuisance to full-blown tyrant. Monday morning I found a thick envelope duct-taped to my front gate, stamped with the seal of the Oakridge Estates Homeowners Association. Inside were a half-dozen notice of violation forms. Violation #1 unpermitted agricultural equipment visible from the road. Violation number A, fence line not compliant with HOA visual standards. Violation number 3, non-conforming structure, the old barn. Violation number 4, livestock kept within 150 feet of a residence. Violation #5, failure to submit landscaping plan to the Architectural Review Committee. I stood by the fence, reading the list with a bitter grin. This wasn't regulation enforcement. This was targeted harassment. Every so-called violation was either fabricated or applied retroactively without legal foundation. It was lawfare by paper cuts, and Karen was playing dirty. She hadn't just read my title as landowner, she had dug deeper. I was certain she'd discovered my credentials as a civil litigation attorney, and now she was scrambling to bury me in technicalities before I could retaliate. I tossed the forms in a box labeled evidence in my study and got back to work, repairing the corral. But the next blow came that same evening. I returned from the hardware store to find the gravel access road, my driveway blocked by a bright orange construction barrier and a thick chain locked between 2 posts. A sign dangled from the padlock like a smirk. Private road HOA, access only, trespassers will be prosecuted. My jaw clenched. This wasn't just posturing. This was an attempt to cut me off from my own home. I took photos of everything, posts, even the tire tracks leading away from the installation. She had the gall to physically wall me out, hoping I'd lose my temper and give her grounds to escalate. I didn't bite. Instead, I took out my phone and called a tow service to haul the barrier off my property at her expense, of course. I made sure to keep the lock intact and hand-delivered it the next morning to her front door, sealed in an evidence bag like a little legal love note. Her reaction came swiftly. By Thursday, I received a formal letter from the HOA attorney. It was a sloppy cut-and-paste cease and desist order citing disruption of community cohesion and unauthorized property modifications. The letter demanded immediate cessation of all ranch activities and voluntary compliance with HOA bylaws. Voluntary compliance. The language was designed to sound polite, but the message was clear. Surrender, or we'll escalate. I chuckled and began drafting my response. What Karen failed to realize was that the legal system was my battleground. While she relied on suburban intimidation and HOA gossip, I had precedent, property law, and 20 years of courtroom experience on my side. But I wasn't going to fire back just yet. First, I did my homework. I drove down to the county recorder's office and pulled every HOA filing for the last 10 years. The Oak Ridge Estates HOA had overstepped their legal boundaries. Their charter never extended into the original ranch lands. The so-called expansion vote wasn't recognized by the county. No deeds had been amended. No landowner consent had been recorded. Karen hadn't just been pushy, she had fabricated authority, and now I had her in my sights. That evening, I sat at the same kitchen table my grandfather once carved his initials into and laid out my plan. I would file a motion for a temporary injunction to bar further HOA harassment. I'd sue for unlawful interference with land use, trespass, and civil intimidation. If the court allowed, I'd press for punitive damages and legal fees. But most importantly, I'd drag her HOA into the spotlight, force every shady tactic into the public record. Karen wanted to rule this neighborhood like a queen. I was going to turn her throne into a witness stand. And when I was done, she wouldn't be presiding over a neighborhood. She'd be defending herself in court. The courtroom was small but tense, one of those county chambers, where the judge's gavel sounded louder than thunder and the walls smelled faintly of lemon, cleaner, and old paper. I sat alone at the plaintiff's table, sleeves rolled, case files in order, and confidence settled deep in my bones. Karen sat across from me, flanked by her attorney, a nervous man with a cheap suit and a stack of disorganized binders he'd barely skimmed. The judge, Honorable Margaret Fielding, entered, her gaze sharp enough to cut steel. She was known for her no-nonsense approach, and today she looked particularly unamused. "Mr. Barrett," she said, eyeing me over her glasses, "you're representing yourself." "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, standing calmly. "Licensed in 3 states. Civil litigation, 20 years. She nodded, then turned to Karen's lawyer. "And you're here on behalf of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association." He cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor, and on behalf of Mrs. Karen Monroe, HOA President." The proceedings began. I opened with clarity. "Your Honor, I'm here today seeking an injunction against the Oak Ridge Estates HOA for unlawful harassment, trespass, and attempted usurpation of private property. The association, under Mrs. Monroe's leadership, has falsely claimed jurisdiction over my ranch, despite no lawful annexation, no recorded deed changes, and no agreement from me or my predecessors." I laid out the evidence: photos of the blocked access road, scanned copies of every violation notice, certified letters, even a video recording of Karen admitting the so-called expansion was based on a board vote. Then, the crown jewel, county land records confirming the HOA's charter stopped nearly a mile short of my property. Karen's lawyer objected half-heartedly. "Your Honor, our client acted in good faith based on community interests and local precedent." I interrupted. "Good faith does not excuse illegal expansion, intimidation, or false reporting." The judge raised a hand, silencing us both. "Let me see that charter." She flipped through the papers I'd submitted, frowning. "There's no amendment here, no recorded change to boundaries, no owner consent. Mrs. Monroe, did you ever file a legal annexation with the county?" Karen stood, trying to maintain her composure. "Well, Your Honor, the board voted unanimously. We assume there's no legal annexation by assumption," Judge Fielding said flatly. "You either file it, or you don't." Karen's confidence cracked. She glanced at her lawyer, who now looked like he wanted to vanish into the carpet. I continued. "In addition to the unlawful claims, Mrs. Monroe personally contacted law enforcement to report me as a trespasser on my own land. Her fabricated authority resulted in armed deputies confronting me without cause. That's abuse of process and defamation of title." The judge scribbled notes, then looked up. "Do you have evidence of this?" "Yes," I said, handing over a copy of the sheriff's incident report and a voice recording of Karen threatening to bring the law down. On me for ignoring the HOA. She intentionally misled authorities to intimidate me into vacating land she had no legal control over. Karen tried to speak again. That land has been a nuisance for years. Untrimmed, unkempt, devalues the community. Community standards don't override property law, I replied coolly. Judge Fielding sat back. The room still. Her ruling came swift and hard. This court grants Mr. Barrett's injunction. The HOA will cease all enforcement actions against his property immediately. Furthermore, the court finds that the association acted outside its legal bounds. Mr. Barrett is entitled to pursue damages in civil court. Karen's face drained of color, and Mrs. Monroe, the judge added, "You are personally reprimanded for misrepresenting jurisdiction to law enforcement. I suggest you seek legal counsel regarding potential personal liability." The gavel cracked once court is adjourned. As I gathered my documents, I glanced across the aisle. Karen sat frozen, like the realization had just hit. She wasn't above the law. She'd picked the wrong man to push. This wasn't just a win, it was a warning. But for Karen, the real battle was just beginning, and I was only getting started. The courthouse victory rippled through Oak Ridge like a storm rolling over dry plains. I didn't have to say a word. Word of mouth did it for me. Karen Monroe, the self-declared queen of the HOA, had been publicly humbled, her authority dismissed, in a courtroom where her clipboard meant nothing. But I wasn't done. The ruling gave me more than peace, it gave me leverage. Within days, neighbors began showing up at my gate, some curious, some cautious. Most were frustrated victims of the same HOA overreach I'd just dismantled. Retired couples, single parents, ranch hands, they all had stories. Arbitrary fines, forced landscaping changes, threats of legal action, over toolsheds and mailbox colors. Karen had built her empire on fear. I handed them copies of my case brief and encouraged them to file claims. More than a dozen did. I offered to represent them for free, not for profit, for justice. Karen didn't show her face for a while. But the HOA board kept sending out letters, some groveling, some defiant. They attempted to distance themselves from her actions, claiming she acted independently, though half the documents bore her signature alongside theirs. So I subpoenaed the board meeting minutes. Turns out, the rot ran deeper than Karen. The board had rubber-stamped nearly every outrageous decision she made, often without quorum. They bypassed voting protocols, approved illegal expansion zones, and even used HOA dues to fund a private security patrol that never existed. I filed a class action suit within a month, representing 17 homeowners. The charges: fraudulent misrepresentation, unlawful assessment collection, and violation of state HOA governance laws. The court date was set for early fall. Then came the audit. The state HOA oversight division, now tipped off by our filings, sent a formal investigator to Oak Ridge. What they uncovered wasn't just civil mismanagement, it bordered on criminal behavior. Funds had gone missing. Karen had written checks to fictitious contractors and reimbursed herself for board-approved business trips to resorts to states over. When the story hit the local paper, it made front-page headlines. President faces fraud investigation, legal exposes suburban corruption. I won't lie, kept a copy of that headline on my fridge. Karen tried to claim ignorance, claimed it was all a misunderstanding, claimed I was orchestrating a vendetta, but the law doesn't care about excuses. When she finally stood trial for misappropriation of funds, I sat in the front row, suit pressed, pen in hand. I didn't say a word. I let the evidence speak for itself. Bank records, fake invoices, falsified votes. The jury deliberated less than 4 hours. Guilty on 3 counts of fraud. Civil liabilities pending. The HOA dissolved by year's end. A new voluntary association formed, one rooted in transparency and mutual respect. No more harassment, no more phantom rules. I stood by the ranch gate the day the old HOA sign was taken down. A county worker yanked the post free, and it hit the dirt with a dull final thud. Freedom never sounded so good. A few days later, Karen drove past the ranch. She didn't stop, didn't roll down her window, but she looked just long enough to make eye contact. Her face had changed. Not smug at all. Just quiet, defeated. That's the thing about power built on paper fences. It doesn't hold up when the storm comes, and I am the storm. Back in my office, I pinned her last cease and desist letter to my corkboard, a trophy, not out of spite, but as a reminder. Some people abuse power because they think no one will stop them, but if they try it on the wrong man, say a rancher with a JD and a memory like Steelwell, then they get more than they bargained for. Justice wasn't just served, it was delivered, and I made damn sure it was signed, stamped, and legally binding.